One of the weirder games I played in 2024 was a visual novel slash strategy RPG by the name of Process of Elimination. The premise of it is very up my alley. A serial killer by the name of the Quartering Duke is committing a mass slaughter across Japan, killing over 100 people in executions that are frequently broadcast on live television and are always double kills for some reason. There are no clues, no leads, no nothing, just a series of calling cards left by the killer. The Japanese government, up against the wall to end the chaos and catch the Quartering Duke, brings in the Detective Alliance, a squad of the 100 most elite detectives in the country and abroad, all referred to by mysterious codenames and renowned for their unique investigative abilities. You play as Wado Hojo, who gets recruited as the rank 100 detective at the beginning of the game by Senior Detective before being abducted and brought to the mysterious island headquarters of the DA. He's gifted the name Incompetent Detective by his peers, and before long, bodies start popping up on the island. The Quartering Duke is there with them, and it's up to you to solve the case through a combination of visual novel conversations and Fire Emblem-esque investigations. The murders are brutal, elaborate, and theatrical. The characters range from slay girl boss to not like the other girls but in a fun way to toxic old man yaoi even though they're like 17 and 29, so it's actually problematic age gap yaoi. The music is excellent and the art style matches the quality throughout. The mystery itself is exciting and interesting and full of twists. Just in general, it really has everything I would want from a game. And yet, I still don't really know how I feel about it. I finished it well over a year ago back in September of 2024, and every time it comes up, I still feel a little bit conflicted. Like, it's a game that I absolutely think is worth playing, and I don't regret having played it, but I have a hard time articulating or even justifying why I would recommend it to somebody else. It's not bad, to be clear. Like, I do want to establish that up front. If it was, I think I've proven that I would have no problem just saying so. But also, I have a hard time calling it good without any sort of a qualifier either. Like, Buried Stars was a flawed game that I would absolutely recommend in a heartbeat, and I have no hesitation in calling it a really good game that I really liked. This year I made a 6-hour-long video fighting for my fucking life to defend Danganronpa V3, a game that plenty of people hate and yet I still really love. When I offered 28 topics for my community to vote on for a new video, the one they picked was a video about how the 100-line Last Defense Academy was like Game of the Year in 2025. And I stand by that assessment, even though it's a game that I think you have to put a lot of hours into before you'll love it like I do. And yet, for some reason, I still hesitate on Process of Elimination. When I first finished it last year, I thought I'd make a video about the ending, or the themes, or the pacing of the game, but I also kind of thought I should wait until I'd figured out how I felt about it before I, tried to say how I feel. And also because I was hoping that eventually it would help me feel a little bit more coherent about the game, like give me some sort of an understanding about it. And yet, the opposite has happened. The longer I've had to mull over Process of Elimination, the more I've felt conflicted about it. It's still not bad, and I don't regret the 30 or 40 hours or so that I put into it, but I still don't know how to talk about it. That should not be interpreted as me saying I don't have any words for it though, as indicated by the length of this video. It's just that it's too complicated to sum up with a, it's good and here's why, or it's the worst and I'm making that your problem kind of deal. I am not the first YouTuber to talk about how it's hard to talk about a game when you can't really begin with a simple premise of, I liked it, or I didn't like it, or this game is terrible and here's why, or this company's design philosophy is outdated and here's why. Because it's hard to really form a coherent argument without a coherent premise. And it's hard to really make it engaging for people if you admit up front that you don't really know how exactly you feel about the thing you're asking them to spend their time listening to you rant about. Like, nuance is hard, and making the pitch for nuance to an audience is even harder. Rest assured, I have a lot of strong feelings about this one, and by the time we're done, I'm hoping you will too. It's a game that I think fans of the genre should play because they will, I think at least, appreciate it for what it is. It's a game for people who've also never played anything like it because I think they could also enjoy it, and it really does bring a lot to the table. The people who have played it before, I think know what I'm talking about here. And if you choose to play it either yourself before watching this video or just alongside it, then I think you will too. Process of Elimination is a Switch exclusive, but if you don't have a Switch and want to experience the game as it's being played, the VODs playlist is over in my VODs channel and you can find the little pop-up in the top right for it if you'd like to check that out. Typically my videos about visual novels where I go this in depth go, chapter by chapter. But that's not really super viable for this video because the issues the game has are a little bit too big picture on that structural level to be served by a chapter by chapter analysis, and I feel like I'd kind of end up missing the forest for the trees. And also, I do not have the time for another 6-hour video. We can't do that again. Instead, the way this is going to work is that we'll begin with the basics. Premise, characters, setting, gameplay, that stuff. Then from there, we'll discuss the story in a few chunks. While this game does have 5 named chapters plus a prologue and a final chapter, we're going to be breaking this game down into 3 acts for the purposes of discussion. Act 1 includes the prologue, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, while Act 2 includes Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, and Act 3 includes Chapter 5 and the final chapter. For people who've played the game, you'll understand why I'm breaking up this way, and if you haven't, you're going to see why soon. Once you've gone through each act, we'll do a final section covering the themes of the game and why it was ultimately the finale of this game, specifically the reveal of the mastermind and their motivations, that turned Process of Elimination into a game that, over a year later, I still don't really know how to talk about concisely. And with that, let's get into it. Section 1. The Basics. So, as mentioned, the basic premise of this game is that you're playing a turn-based strategy RPG visual novel hybrid. Fire Emblem meets Danganronpa kind of deal. Mysteries are solved by characters running around a map using their abilities to investigate, solve mysteries, and collect clues to try and solve the puzzle. It plays a little bit like a lot of games you've probably played before, but there's nothing exactly like it out there that at least as far as I'm aware. Different characters have different abilities and skill point allocations, and they can combine them to try and improve their odds of success. Some characters will refuse to work with you and can run off into hazards, getting themselves killed unless you're able to use the characters that you can control to defeat the hazard first. You have a set number of turns to complete the investigation, with each turn corresponding to roughly an hour or so of in-game time. If you run out of time, you fail, and odds are you'll have to repeat a few investigations because you won't know how best to position the people to first go round. The game actively encourages this approach too. There are fragments of characters' memories scattered all around the maps, and there are terms to add to the in-game lexicon to try and fill out your knowledge, but some of those can only be collected on a second playthrough, or even just a first playthrough where you're willing to sacrifice some people. The rest of the game plays out as a pretty typical visual novel, with a lot of reading and occasional choices regarding how you want to answer questions that don't really super matter a ton. Honestly, gameplay-wise, it's functionally exactly what you'd expect from something like this, and that part's pretty uncomplicated. It's the narrative of this game that's hard to process, and that's what we're primarily going to focus on in this section. Section 1, Act 1. The Premise. Process of Elimination begins with Wado Hojo, an amateur detective in training, being accosted by an old man in an alleyway, told he's being invited to join a league of extraordinary freak detectives, and then being drugged and dragged away to a mysterious island called Morgue, where he wakes up in a coffin playing an iPad video of an old man telling him what to do. Coincidentally, the same old man he met before, who drugged him in an alleyway. In this universe, Japan has been besieged by a crime wave that's required a massive upsurge in detectives to try and solve the cases, and Wado was one of them. However, he is now in the big leagues, being inducted into the Detective Alliance. The DA is the top-tier detective organization, boasting a wide array of talented detectives. Or at least he used to. More on that in a second. But their current priority is the case of the Quartering Duke. The Quartering Duke is our narrative's villain, having gone on a massive killing spree of over 100 people across Japan, often killing their victims in theatrical, brutal, public ways. Nobody can figure out who they are, why they're doing it, or how they're picking their victims. There are never any clues that point to the killer at any of the crime scenes, and given how this rampage has come to epitomize the rampant crime in the country, the government is desperate to solve it. The Duke pops up throughout the game in between chapters, sort of like a Monokuma Theater type of deal, to talk about their motives, ambitions, philosophy, etc., all that good stuff in very vague ways. So, as mentioned, Wado was kidnapped by a mysterious old man who drugged him in an alley. Or, in his terminology, the detectives anyways, he was invited to join the Detective Alliance, somewhat against his will, by Senior Detective, the #1 detective in the DA. DA detectives all use codenames to keep their true identities a secret, even from one another, and all 100 detectives are ranked against one another as well. Wado, as the newest in the bunch, is ranked number 100. At least, in theory he was. In practice, somebody's been getting busy slaughtering a ton of the DA's members, including a whole host of scientists on the island, so Wado's position is probably actually a fair bit higher. A handful of the other surviving detectives, we'll get to them in a minute too, discover Wado on the island, and after determining that he probably is telling the truth about being the newest member and isn't the killer, he's given his formal codename by Downtown Detective. Wado Hojo is now Incompetent Detective. For reasons that will become clear in a bit, the detectives determine the Quartering Duke is on the island with them, and they resolve to identify who it is and finally end the murder spree. To do so, they rely on the unique abilities that they each bring to the table, which include everything from communing with the dead to being incredibly brave, being descended from infamous union busters, being able to work like really hard, being excellent at social infiltration, being able to be killed by literally anything, and wearing a sick-ass suit of really good armor. Not to point any fingers here, but some of these people really got the short end of the stick. Then again, given that our social deduction expert Downtown Detective is basically Junko Enoshima if she were a detective, maybe there's more to them than meets the eye. Anyways, that's the basic premise, and we'll get more into the story in just a sec. But first, who are these illustrious members of the Detective Alliance? Section 1, Act 2. The Characters. Out of an agency of 100 detectives, only 14 remain alive and well, as far as we know. And also well-ish, depending on how we factor mental health into all that at the start of the game. Each of the 14 is known only by their codename, and while some important details about their backstories are revealed throughout the game, we'll focus primarily on what they bring to the table immediately out of the gate. We'll start with our villain and then work our way through the detectives in ascending order of their ranking in the Detective Alliance, since I can't really think of any other good way to organize any of this. The Quartering Duke. The antagonist of the story, the mysterious Quartering Duke, is apparently somewhere on Morgue. Maybe. They're really more Zero from Zero Escape than Monokuma from Danganronpa, save for the theatrics. The Duke gives a monologue between each chapter, and has historically broadcast the murders on television. In spite of all this, there's never been any way to solve the murders, and there's only really a single consistency. Every murder is a double kill, with 2 victims being killed together. They have seemingly infiltrated the DA, having killed a huge amount of the detectives on Morgue, and might even be among the survivors on the island at this very moment. But again, getting ahead of myself. They're represented by this icon thing in their monologues, and this is their voice. The way we meet them is in the opening scene, where they ask you to pick between one of 2 victims to die in a public majority vote. A very your turn to die moment. In fact, the whole opening of the game is also very your turn to die, but again, we'll get there when we get there. Incompetent Detective. Our protagonist, the 17-year-old Flop Wado Hojo, ranked at the very bottom of the 100-member Detective Alliance. He begins the game on Morgue in a locker, which really reinforces the Shuichi Saihara vibes coming off of him that you might have picked up on. He makes his way to the mansion on the island, Gormenghast Manor, at the instruction of Senior Detective on his D-pad, and on the way, he has a premonition of something bad when he walks past a strange building. If you're smart, you'll listen to that premonition, but if you choose to check it out, you'll get an early game over. His nickname comes from Downtown Detective, who bestowed it upon him because she thought it was funny that he didn't seem to have any notable skills or abilities that would justify his presence on the island, much less in the DA. In fact, everybody's perplexed as to why he's here, with the group initially assuming he must be a killer responsible for the bodies that you might have gotten a game over for finding earlier. But yet again, more on that in a sec. Armor Detective. The number 32 detective and the lowest ranking detective we meet aside from Wado, Armor Detective is kind of just dumb as hell, and you can't help but love him for it. Adorned in impenetrable armor and an unstoppable chivalric personality, the 21-year-old clearly specced entirely into strength and charisma with no thought towards intelligence or wisdom. His own bio states that he solves his cases through his unrivaled tenacity, even though he, quote, struggles with using his mental faculties, which is devastatingly brutal for your own bio. Love him though, he never takes off the armor, and he's usually just pretty fun to have around. Also, his sprite is mirrored in a way that's really jarring because the eye holes on his helmet will swap aside constantly, and it is really weird that they've made this choice to go with that for him. Whatever, moving on. Rowdy Detective. The number 25 detective, Rowdy, is a wild card. Armed with super strength and a tough attitude, she's actually a pretty sensitive kid who really cares about the people around her. She takes an approach of always saying yes to whatever life throws her way and never letting anything stop her, which is how she managed to crack into the top 25 of the DA at just 14. Rowdy's the type of person to say, let's flip a coin. Heads I do it, tails I don't, when she's undecided about something, and then flip a coin which has 2 heads just to make sure she does it. She's extremely perceptive to match her extreme strength with abilities that are almost superhuman but not quite there. Or maybe they are quite there, but we just don't see as much of it. She's a little bit Mizuki from I, the Somnium Files, and she's also just very fun, and I like her a lot. Downtown Detective. The number 22 detective in the DA, her special skill is social investigation. In other words, she is the social butterfly. She presents the veneer of a bit of a ditzy blonde with a brash attitude, but is a shrewd detective in her own right. Imagine Kyoko Kirigiri meets Regina George. She's a social media influencer and fashion girly too. Downtown is a bit of a rough localization that misses the mark on her, something that happens throughout the game, but her Japanese name of Shibuya Detective makes it a bit clearer what her vibe is meant to be. She's shopping, fashion, social media influencer, gossiping mean girl. She could have figured out who killed Alison Delantis in like 30 seconds tops, and at 16 years old would have been like maybe the 3rd most evil 16-year-old in Rosewood. She is incidentally also probably my favorite character in the game, and I absolutely love her. Techie Detective. The number 20 detective in the DA, Techie's specialty is technological tools to help him solve crimes. Or rather, his forensic friends. Don't call them tools, it makes him sad. He is a researcher, a scientist, and an inventor above all else, using his insane technological skills to solve cases that would otherwise seem impossible for a 12-year-old, or for anyone else for that matter. He is a great character, and also, incidentally, the first character in a wheelchair that I can remember in a game like that really seems to handle it pretty well, all things considered. We don't count Delta because that's bullshit, and it's also a topic for another video, but overall, he doesn't really get treated as patronizingly as you see a lot of disabled characters. Also, his color scheme is probably my favorite in the game. The turquoise color he has is just very pretty. I don't know why that really sticks out in my mind, but it does. Moving on. Bookworm Detective. The number 15 detective and the youngest in the game at just 11 years old, Bookworm is a really fun character, honestly. Her ability is a photographic memory, being able to recall anything she's seen in any of the 10,000 books she's read and beyond. But she's also an incredibly shy kid, all things considered. She is distrustful, snarky, and witty, quick with a clever comeback and quicker with an unambiguous insult, but all delivered through a third-person narration of her own perspective. Think like Tiffany Pollard if she was a Japanese middle schooler with an anxiety disorder. Her parents were murdered when she was young, and she was taken in by the detective who solved the case, who raised her into becoming a detective herself. Doleful Detective. The number 14 detective, 17-year-old Doleful, has the unique ability of being what the game describes as a danger magnet. Danger always finds him, but he's immune to the consequences of it himself thanks to his keen senses. It makes him a very anxious, timid kid. His parents were killed by an earthquake, and every other family that took him in has met with their death in their own way. And it's hard to not really internalize that as a kid. In a universe where Danganronpa hadn't permanently staked a claim on what it means to be lucky in a visual novel like this, he probably would have been the lucky detective, or the unlucky detective or something. He has tremendously good luck personally, but only by basically sucking all the luck out of the room and doing everyone else in a way that's definitely legally distinct from Nagato Komaeda, I promise. He is a really interesting character though, especially as he grapples with what it means to be a basically permanent debuff to anyone who's close to him, and how he can use that to help solve some impossible cases. Workaholic Detective. The number 10 detective in the DA, and our first actual adult on the list since Armor Detective, Workaholic is constantly given the Lexi Love treatment of being acted like he is old, ancient even, despite only being about 29. To be fair, this is mostly because he acts like the old man of the group, typically being the one to set rules and make plans and also enforce them. His whole deal is that he's basically a salaryman by day, detective by night. He had to beg both his wife and his boss to let him pursue detective work, and has become a reliable but forgettable part of the DA in the years since. He is fairly hot-tempered and gets his nickname from the fact that he's basically insatiably eager to work, something which might ultimately mean nothing. Gourmet Detective. The number 9 detective, and for some reason this is how she's dressed. She is a 27-year-old with a super palate, able to taste things so well that she can even sense emotions in it. Doesn't have to be food either, and if it's poisonous, well, that's just a unique flavor. She got this ability because during the Dayless Night incident, we will get to that one later, she got trapped in rubble for a month after an earthquake. The 14-year-old gourmet survived by eating concrete and debris, which sure, why not, I guess. Anyways, now she loves eating and making food and is extremely good at it. She's taken on a big sister role for Rowdy since the latter joined the DA, and kind of just takes that same role on with the group in general. Mystic Detective. The number 7 detective, Mystic is the go-to man for any case involving the occult. His spiritualism, ability to speak to those beyond the grave, and his willingness to take a supernatural case seriously all enabled him to become a top detective in the DA. At 42, he's beaten in age only by senior detective, and he serves as a father figure for Bookworm. Remember how I mentioned that bit about how she was taken in by the detective who solved the case of her parents' murder? That was Mystic, and the case was the case of the lycanthrope. A situation where it seemed like Werewolf must have done it, which is absurd, of course, but actually, Bookworm's favorite teacher, who instilled her love for reading in her, had raised his son up to kill them for revenge for something. I don't remember what it was. Insane shit. Mystic is basically the only person Bookworm trusts anymore, and he takes that trust very seriously. Posh Detective. The number 5 detective in the Alliance, the 21-year-old Pinkerton. Yes, of those Pinkertons. I made a whole video about their presence in gaming last year that you should check out in the card in the top right. Came to Japan with the goal of repairing the tarnished Pinkerton name by founding the Pinkerton Japan Detective Agency. Her name is more, let's say, aspirational than realistic, with her family having fallen on hard times for their actions. Actions that this game will go out of its way to never actually address or discuss at all, which is very funny. Like, it'll only ever discuss them in the terms of like, well, they were once a prominent detective family, but then something has happened and their reputation's gone downhill. However, she does still possess what the game describes as aesthetic eye as her ability, the ability to notice even the slightest of deviations or errors from what should be happening. No detail escapes her attention, and it serves her well when solving cases involving forgeries or inside jobs. Her most notable case, the case of the altered Mona Lisa, is a reference to a famous Pinkerton escort mission where they brought it across the ocean. Renegade Detective. The number 4 detective is an evil homosexual murderer in some killer red heels. At just 17 years old, Renegade is one of the top detectives in the DA, but it's not because he's well loved. He very much so is not, becoming infamous for being able and willing to commit just absolute atrocities for fun. He's rarely allowed out of prison unless it's time to solve a case, and is fitted with what the game calls a decapitation rabbit, a bomb collar that'll go off if he misbehaves. You might ask why he's even here, and the answer is that being an evil sadist with a nearly unmatched criminal mind has given him a pretty good insight into how to catch a criminal. Nobody particularly likes him. Few people enjoy being around people who've murdered their parents in cold blood, but he seemingly has a uniquely hostile relationship with Workaholic. Again, this could mean nothing. Ideal Detective. The number 2 detective in the Alliance, Kyoko Kirigiri, Ideal Detective, is yet another 17-year-old master detective, the 4th in the current group of DA detectives alongside Incompetent, Renegade, and Doleful, with Downtown being just 16. However, there is a reason why she is number 2 in the DA. Namely, she can see into the future. Described in-game as the modern Sherlock Holmes, Ideal has risen to 2nd in command of the DA. But for some curious reason, Incompetent really seems to recognize her when he first meets her. And we will get to that in a second. I am sure you were tired of hearing me say that already, but I promise we'll get there. Lastly, we have Senior Detective, an unranked detective in the DA and the oldest in the Alliance that we meet at 62. Senior Detective is how Watto finds his way into the Alliance. We don't really talk to him much, we just get that brief introduction where he demonstrates Watto's incompetence before giving him an invitation he can't refuse. Literally. He drugs Watto with a needle and seemingly is the one who deposited him on Morgue, providing him instructions with the D-pad. While Senior doesn't have an official rank, he was still a founding member of the Alliance and is kind of like semi-retired, I think. He mostly just works on recruiting people and doing stuff behind the scenes. We won't meet him again for a little bit, but stay with me, we'll get there when we get there. Section 1, Act 3. The setting and gameplay. Alright, with all that established, there's just a few details about the setting that we have to get through, and then some explanations about how the game actually plays. Process of elimination takes place on the mysterious island of Morgue, headquarters of the Detective Alliance. The island itself features 2 key buildings, Snark's, a research lab, and Gormenghast, a mansion for the detectives to reside in when they have business on the island. Morgue is isolated from the rest of the world, and Gormenghast is especially so due to the island's unique geography. The island has what's called a unique double caldera formation, with the mansion being located on the rim of the inner ring and the research facility being located at the base. This makes contact with the outside world extremely difficult, and access to the island typically requires a helicopter to land at the research lab's helipad. Snark's is the building that Watto had a bad feeling about when he passed by it at the beginning of the game, and if you had chosen to enter it, you would have discovered a whole lot of deadly poison gas and a pile of dead researchers inside it. Turns out, while Watto might be ranked 100 right now, there is a very good chance that he'll be getting a lot of promotions really quickly because, a bunch of positions were suddenly vacated on account of most of his superiors being murdered. Now, not saying that you should emulate this or anything, but it does provide a pretty clear path for promotion if you're desperate and or work for an insane detective agency. Or you're just in the current job market and times are tough. If you follow your gut and avoid the building though, Watto will climb the hill up to Gormenghast, enter the mansion's doors, and... well, at that point we're getting into the story. But I will explain Gormenghast just a little bit first. It is a big old mansion, but very much so built with defensive mechanisms in place in case the island was ever attacked. Because that's what happens to detectives, is that they are attacked. Like they're an army of these teenagers who are kind of not very socially adept. There are traps hidden throughout the building, most of which the detectives know about, but not all, as well as hidden passages, other traps that are even more hidden, and more. The more is also mostly just traps, to be honest. If the detectives need to fortify themselves inside, though, the mansion can pretty quickly become a fortress to protect them. Then again, a fortress can become a prison in a hurry. Surely that's not going to happen here, though. When it comes to gameplay, Process of Elimination is a hybrid visual novel that I used to describe just as Danganronpa meets Fire Emblem. But now we have the 100-line Last Defense Academy, which is literally just that, so that's the better comparison to make here. The game is split between visual novel components and a unique approach to strategy RPG combat systems where you're not really doing combat. Instead, you're using detective skills on items, exploring the map, avoiding enemies, disabling traps, all within a limited number of turns using everyone's stats. Some characters are really good at investigating clues, others are good at deducing where to look next, some are good at analyzing the clues that you found, and some just aren't very good at much except for being a cheerleader. Each target, like each mystery that you're trying to uncover or each clue you're trying to figure out, has a set amount of health that can be either willed away across multiple turns by characters using the relevant skills, or sometimes just have to be taken out in one turn because otherwise the thing will kill them instantly, or maybe it just needs to be solved in a single turn for some reason. Your detectives don't really fight back though, so when there are enemies, you're going to be mostly just using them with high mobility to kite them away from the ones who are solving the case. The cheerleader thing wasn't a joke either. Some characters are good at assisting others more than doing anything else, and they can boost other people's performances at their task rather than trying to contribute to it directly. Anyways, by now we've established where the story happens, who it's happening to, and the basics of how you're going to experience it. The real challenging part of this game that makes it complicated to talk about really is the story itself, so we should probably start getting into that now. Section 2. The Story. So, as mentioned earlier, the story segment will be broken up into 3 acts. We're going to go with Act 1, The Game is Afoot, which covers the prologue and the first 2 chapters. Act 2, The Game is Underground, covering the 3rd and 4th chapters. And Act 3, The Game is Over, covering the final chapters of the game. It's done this way because this isn't just going to be a narrative summary. I am well aware of the reputation of video essays on that front, but an analysis of what makes it complicated to talk about and why, just in general, this game doesn't really give itself an easy out. And so instead of just running through the story beat by beat, I want to focus on the overarching issues of each of these unofficial acts. And also, I should say talk about the positives. It isn't a bad game, and I worry about that kind of getting lost and trying to get to the bottom of what makes it complicated, because that mostly just involves exploring the things that are less unambiguously positive. So I'll make an effort to try and bring up the positives as we go as well. I have taken on the feedback from the V3 video where people decided that I was not being actually defensive of the game enough. So message received, okay? Promise. Also, spoiler rules are in effect from this point on. Once we get into Act 1, anything from Act 1 is up for grabs, but nothing from any future chapters will be spoiled. And I would highly recommend either playing the game for yourself or watching the VODs to experience it in its fullest. I'll also avoid spoiling anything that isn't necessary to spoil in this process as much as possible, so hopefully, even if you do decide to watch this whole thing and then want to play it afterwards, there'll still be some things that can surprise you. Anyways, so let's get into this story. Section 2, Act 1. The Game is Afoot. Act 1 of this game is busy. And I mean that in a genuinely very positive way overall. Like a lot of games in this genre, justifying the premise of the deadly circumstances the characters find themselves in is something that Process of Elimination does struggle with. The first interaction with Senior is very blunt and does genuinely feel really similar to Your Turn to Die, but that being said, that's a pretty good game that I really like, and I think it has a good opening, so I don't think that's really a negative. You get drugged and dropped off on the island and told to make your way to Gormenghast. Along the way, you walk past Snarks, Watto gets his first of many flashes of insight that he should probably not go inside, and then moves on. When he heads into the manor, something causes him to move out of the way as a chandelier collapses where he'd been standing, knocking him unconscious. From this point on, he starts to meet the other characters kind of in waves. Workaholic, Downtown, Rowdy, and Techie in the first wave, with the others appearing as necessary. Everyone is obviously, understandably, pretty extremely suspicious of Watto, given that he just showed up out of nowhere with no warning and suddenly an entire building of researchers and their colleagues are dead. The other detectives were there because they'd been called specifically to try and get to the bottom of the Quartering Duke case once and for all, and nobody except for Senior knew Watto even existed. Eventually the characters are like, hey, so Senior's supposed to be here somewhere, let's go find him. And then we find a secret passageway under the building full of razor wire traps. And this is where we get to really see Doleful's ability at play. See, most of the detectives have pretty human, if impressive, abilities. Even for Mystic, his supposed mystical abilities aren't really what makes him such a good detective. It's more that he's just willing to take a supernatural premise seriously and get to the bottom of it, rather than scoffing at the idea and missing something important in the process. If a case looks like a werewolf did it, he will investigate it as if that is a valid, legitimate possibility, which helps him solve cases where other people might run into a dead end. Doleful, like a couple other detectives, namely Incompetent and Ideal, has a more unique ability in that it is functionally superhuman of him. He historically has attracted danger to himself, but he is immune to it, which makes him an excellent canary in the coal mine. It's not just that he won't be hurt by something, like that it'll bounce right off of him, but instead that the fates will conspire to protect him, such as someone else noticing that something would have hurt him, and then stopping him from getting hurt. If you put him at the front of the group, walking through the dark into a maze of deadly razor wire, he'll instinctively be able to detect it, or other characters will notice it and stop him, a perfect glint of light will catch it just in time. This extends pretty far. if someone tried to shoot Doleful, the gun would jam, or someone else would dive in front of the bullet, or the bullet would miss, or something like that. Again, very Nagato Kamada of him, but legally distinct, so it's fine. Anyways, they get to the end of the tunnel and find the first of this act's many, many bodies. Senior detectives. Womp womp. We care so much. Old man's been chopped up into a whole bunch of pieces, with the ceiling absolutely coated in blood for some reason. Turns out there is a reason for that, and after some investigating, the group decides that it was the quartering duke, and that this was supposed to be a double kill. The razor wire was wrapped around Senior in the basement, then fed through the gaps in the floor to tie it to the chandelier. Then when Watto opened the door, it dropped the chandelier to try and kill him, pulling Senior's body up against the ceiling of the basement and then dicing him up. Incompetent also really recognizes Ideal, like I said before. Now we can place the name in the face all together. The way you say that expression, as we all know. He recognizes Ideal as a girl from his dreams, and that is something important for this segment of the game. See, back when Watto was a child, a very incompetent child, he got kidnapped by some mysterious organization. Get to them later, and experimented on in some underground facility. We don't really know much about it at this point, other than that Watto has a recurring dream where he and a girl he now believes to be Ideal Detective are running through this facility as children before encountering some big red evil robot that looks like someone stretched a Roomba to be about 6 feet tall that slices and dices Ideal. In his dreams, Watto fails to save her and has been kinda low-key traumatized by that fact ever since. What's more, Ideal in real life calls him a lifesaver, which is confusing to him because as far as he knows, he definitely did not save her. We also know about a tragedy from 13 years prior called the Dayless Night incident that seems relevant, but come back to that later as well. However, it is worth mentioning at this point because it is one of many instances of the localization of this game kind of missing the mark, like I talked about with Downtown. After all, literally every night is dayless, that's kind of the point, but whatever. They clearly meant something more along the lines of the Endless Night or something, but it's not a big deal. Like I said, it's easy to see this sort of stuff in Downtown Detective as well, whose name kind of misses some important context that's a lot easier to identify in her original name of Shibuya Detective. Anyways, that's not important. What is important is that Ideal is alive. Hooray. Watto can get over this baggage. Except, just kidding, no he can't, because suddenly another one of those evil, scary-looking Roomba things shows up on Morg's helipad when the detectives are investigating the area. And, Ideal gets a little bit too close and makes Watto's dreams reality, making her the second death of Chapter 1. Not to fear though, she soon comes back as Watto's guardian angel for some unknowable reason even to her, although also as a bit of a pervert who uses her new ghostly powers mostly to spy on the other detectives in the bathroom. Why did they do this? Who's to say? We won't be getting back to that later because I have no answers for you. This grants Watto access to Ideal's hidden power of future sight though, although maybe he already had it because he was able to identify and avoid the tragedy in Snarks earlier, but we're not going to think too hard about that. Basically, sometimes he'll get a premonition of a tragedy that'll occur if the timeline isn't changed. Again, there's a localization issue here because when solving cases, Watto says, I will reverse this tragedy, like kind of his version of find a way out, in reference to the tragedy that he seemingly knows will come if he doesn't change anything, but he's not really reversing it so much as undoing or altering or preventing the conditions for that tragedy. Anyways, rip Ideal, welcome back Ideal. We're down 2 detectives but up 1 pervert ghost, and the case must go on because there is still a quartering duke around there somewhere, maybe. Pretty quick, we get a hint about what the next murder is going to be. A meeting room in the mansion is equipped with a trap that will send spikes flying out of the floor if both doors are closed. And after Watto gets a premonition about it, he manages to save himself, Mystic, Downtown, Doleful, and Rowdy by getting them up on the table before they get impaled. Mystic is, unfortunately, getting all the death flags here as one of the only adults left and the father figure to bookworm. And what's more, he's picked up on the fact that Watto's talking to Ideal's ghost because he sees how he keeps looking at something that isn't there. Smart man. Anyways, Techie set up cameras around the mansion to try and catch a killer, but unfortunately all he catches is Mystic Detective's last moments as he suddenly freezes up and collapses in the spike room before the other door closes, even though they had specifically tried to make sure it was forced to stay open. Rip Mystic. Turns out the killer in this case was, drumroll,
一人しかいない。渋谷探偵、君こそが破壊探偵を殺害した透明人間の正体なんだ。
Downtown Detective, girl boss extraordinaire who had painted her nails with a potent poison and then scratched Mystic with them, which caused his collapse. Then she replaced the door stopper with an ice block that eventually melted away, which is why the door closed on its own. Then the floor spikes turned Mystic into a mistake. After being caught, she releases a deadly poison into the mansion, forcing the others into an underground passageway and killing herself in the process. But, as a last act, she reveals that she was part of the Quartering Duke's team all along, and had been the one to kill everyone in Snarks. Act 1 of this game is really, really good. Like, the music is great, the presentation is great, characters are fun, they're voiced really well, the setup is really intriguing. Like, this is this game at its best for sure. When I was playing it at this point, I was recommending it to everyone. Like, Danganronpa meets Fire Emblem. Great. Except everyone's a detective, and they're also broadly pretty competent as detectives, even incompetent. This is actually a pretty compelling premise as a story, in my opinion. Like, they're not the smartest characters in the world, but they're as smart as they should be for the most part for the situation they're in and what they're up against in a way that makes it feel like a fair fight. The fact that downtown was a traitor and that there's clearly more bad guys lurking is a really good way to give the characters a win with a bitter aftertaste when they catch her. You know, usually in these sorts of games, you don't really get a good knife in the ribs of any of the really important bad guys until much later on. The early death of Ideal is a good twist too, and her returning in ghost form for Watto is really interesting because we kind of get the best of both worlds of something like Danganronpa V3, where important characters dying early feels really cool, but also like it leaves the story a bit too big for the remaining characters to fill it. By leaving Ideal around, you still kind of get one of those big characters. It doesn't feel quite as empty, but you still got the consequences of her dying. The detectives each get a good chance to show their worth to the team, and I really like that downtown, the most obvious Junko analog in this game in a genre riddled with Junko knockoffs, is confirmed to just be a villain, but not the villain. Junko's archetype works well for a bad guy, so I'm not mad that they kind of leaned into it, but by using her early, you also get a clear sign that this game knows what kind of assumptions you're bringing in, and is going to have twists with that in mind. Using Senior as the first victim makes sense because all he needs to be is important and powerful, and neither of those things really require you to be alive. And the death of Mystic feels like a predictable gut punch that'll build up the other characters, especially Bookworm. I also just generally really do like the characters here. Everyone brings some charm to the table, whether it's the more quiet ones like Bookworm and Workaholic, or the more rowdy ones like Rowdy. The only one I don't love is Renegade, because this whole deal is kind of shoehorned in and a little bit cliche. Like, it's a lot and I don't love it, but at this point, it's not too bad. Mostly because he's not as central. That being said, we are only at Act 1. Gormenghast is now full of poison gas, leaving only the air or the underground. And since we can't ethically bring a Pinkerton into the one place that's been untouched by capitalism, space, it's time to start going down. That's so stupid. Section 2, Act 2. The game is underground. This is where the game gets, for lack of a better term, squirrely. Our surviving detectives, Renegade, Workaholic, Doleful, Rowdy, Gourmet, Armor, Bookworm, Posh, Techie, and Incompetent, feat Ideal, make their way underground into a weird maze structure, eventually winding up at a prison where you end up spending a little bit too much time on the layout of the place to the point where it's very clear someone's about to die and we're about to have to figure out how it happens using the layout of the building. However, we also get some shocking revelations. Namely, that this underground prison is connected to Incompetence and Ideal's backstory. Watto has watched Ideal get murdered twice by the murder Roombas, and these underground tunnels look exactly like the place where he first saw it happen. No answers to these questions yet, but lots of questions, which implies that we'll get answers eventually, I guess. The first part of this act is the case of the semi-sealed cell, where for a variety of reasons, someone has murdered Rowdy in the night as she slept in a cell that was thought to be sealed. But Watto found himself inside it after getting kidnapped in the night and dropped into a different part of the maze where murder Roombas were chasing him until he found a way out that led directly into her cell. Also, they fought and killed one of the murder Roombas, but that's a separate discussion as well. Also not really super relevant. I don't really know why they had to fight it, but nonetheless, they have fought and killed one of them before Rowdy herself was murdered. The only real reason this is relevant is because the way she was killed was a spike that was dropped into her chest, seemingly, and they got the spike from the murder Roomba. Incompetent has to solve the case here, discovering that it was actually Workaholic who killed Rowdy, but that had been an accident, as he had been trying to kill Renegade, who he has some beef with that we haven't fully explored yet. Chaos ensues after the revelation. It's a whole thing. Renegade and Workaholic both run off into the maze to work it out on the remix, and we're left with just 7 detectives in the group. Now, when I was playing through this game, this was the point where I started to be a bit unsure about it. I still really liked a lot about it. Characters, premise, presentation, all that was still really good. But the story itself was starting to feel like it was spinning its tires. There are unique challenges associated with every part of the narrative, and different storytellers will create even more of them for themselves as they go. For Process of Elimination, I think there was always a plan for the beginning and the end of the story, but not necessarily for the middle. Act 1 takes place mostly in Gormenghast, Act 3 takes place predominantly in Snarks, but Act 2 takes place in a no man's land underground area that ultimately is not used very well. It's not just the main narrative that suffers from this either. The side narratives and character narratives also consistently have this feeling that they know where they want to start and know where they want to end, but not necessarily how they want to get from where they start to where they end. It's like a fanfic where the writer doesn't really know how to pad the story, so they have a few aimless chapters in the middle. It doesn't help that the area itself is very nondescript. Like, it's a lot of reused textures and backgrounds that make it hard to really have any scale or any grasp of just how much movement is happening or if they're moving at all. If it had just been happening for the case of the semi-sealed cell, it'd be one thing. But we still have a whole other underground chapter before we recover. And the problem with this is that if you have a weak mid-game, your endgame inevitably becomes burdened by that. See also Danganronpa V3. However, we also do need to talk a little bit more about the story of this game. At this point, there's two separate stories going on without a clear connection. The first is this present-day story of the Detective Alliance trying to solve the case of the Quartering Duke. But the second is this case we keep hearing about involving the secret police and the Dayless Night incident. So, let me just explain the backstory as we have it here. The Dayless Night incident was a thing where a guy who went by Lucifer, leading a group called the Morning Star of Dawn Society, did some human experimentation and cultish stuff and was very popular and powerful thanks to Lucifer's charisma on television and online programs. Considering it's a Japanese game, I think it's probably meant to be a reference to organizations like the Unification Church and Shinriko for reasons we'll get into later. Apologies for my pronunciation, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. There was a major earthquake 13 years ago, and Lucifer decided to use it to release poison gas into the world for some reason, but then he was foiled by the world's greatest detective, Vidocq. Right after this, a Japanese politician capitalized on it to create the secret police. The secret police's goal wasn't actually to investigate crimes, but rather to try and create detectives who would be able to put a stop to the domestic crime spike that followed, using a whole lot of human experimentation themselves. The new secret police was led by someone named Maestro Detective, but it was overthrown by Ideal Detective and Vidocq, who made it into the Detective Alliance. Now, for our purposes, the most important bit is the human experimentation. Children were kidnapped and experimented on, putting them into terrible danger to try and force them to develop superhuman abilities. Very Zero Escape 999 vibes. The kids were all very young at the time, and were hunted down in some sort of underground facility by the SPXs, the actual name for the murder Roombas, with the goal of creating the conditions that would otherwise be impossible to survive for them. It's never really explained why they needed to use murder Roombas for this, but whatever, we'll accept the contrivance here and there. If you're putting two and two together here, you've deduced that Watto and Ideal were part of this. That's where his nightmare about her dying comes from. But they weren't the only ones. There were at least 5 kids who escaped the facility at one time, including one who's known as Invincible Detective, who is literally unkillable. Nobody could figure out who they were within their group before their escape, but all that's known is that that one experiment, at least, is still out there. Now, remember, Watto and Ideal are 17 themselves, as are Doleful and Renegade. If we assume the secret police didn't have a hard and fast limit on having a 4-year-old specifically for their torture campaign, Downtown might have also been included at 16, and maybe Posh at 21, but everyone else either wasn't really born yet or was too old. Renegade is confirmed to have been one of the 5 experiments who escaped in the group alongside the Invincible Detective, and there are suspicions that he is, in fact, the Invincible Detective. Workaholic is also revealed to have previously worked for the secret police as Diabolic Detective, a title given to him for his participation in the experiments, but afterwards he joined with Ideal and helped take down the secret police, and then he joined the Detective Alliance and became a workaholic to try and atone for his sins torturing children, hence the new nickname. He also knows about who was in the experiments roughly, and believes that the Quartering Duke is also the Invincible Detective, who he believes is Renegade, which is why Workaholic tried to kill him, and it was actually an accident that he killed Rowdy because the rooms got mixed up and people swapped rooms without him realizing it, whatever. However, in his mind, this might be more proof that Renegade is invincible, since that would be an example of the unkillability of invincibility in a way. You might be thinking, wow, that's kind of a lot going on for what's ostensibly a B-plot that's not very well explained, and also is very convoluted and might need more time to kind of digest, and you would be right about that. This is before even getting into the second chapter of this act, where an SPX is chasing them around in circles in the maze, and then Armor grabs the robot and drags down into a pit. Turns out the SPX was following the scent of blood, and Renegade had somehow managed to strap some bloody fabric to Techie's wheelchair. I think it was Rowdy's blood, and that was why the SPX was following them, and also why Armor died. Also, during all of this, Posh has been positioning herself as the leader to replace Ideal post-Roombaing, and she's not necessarily handling it super well, given that like 6 people have died on her watch in the last 3 days or so. It's explained to the others by Gourmet that she is a direct descendant of the Alan Pinkerton, who according to Process of Elimination was just a detective who had an agency that fell from grace for unnamed reasons, and that's where that conversation's going to end. Posh herself is trying to bring the Pinkertons back to their former glory. Heavy air quotes on glory there, let me tell you. And so she established Pinkerton's Japan as part of that. It's a whole thing that goes nowhere other than to explain why she's so dedicated to achieving great things to restore the Pinkerton name. Restore is really doing a lot of work there too. And also why she's supposedly high society, but the Pinkertons post-Civil War were basically just fundamentally evil and also were never really high society figures in that way. Like, I'm not just saying that because I'm a leftist. They were objectively nouveau riche at most and were mostly just the foot soldiers of actually high society wealthy capitalists. Whatever. At this point, the surviving detectives are incompetent, techie, bookworm, doleful, workaholic, gourmet, posh, and renegade. Gourmet has been going through it in the background because of her relationship to Rowdy, and Bookworm's been doing the same because of Mystic, but it's kind of not really possible to give either of them the time that their narratives really need because there's so much else happening in spite of nothing really progressing the way it needs to be. This act drowns in exposition for like 12 different plot threads that are all going on. We've got the murder of Rowdy, the mysterious maze, all these puzzles, the SPXs, the secret police, Invincible Detective, the death of Armor, the reveal that Renegade, Ideal, and Incompetent were all in the human experiments and one of them might be the Invincible Detective, the Dayless Night incident caused by the Morningstar of Dawn Society that led to the formation of the Secret Police, which in turn led to the formation of the Detective Alliance, which contains a lot of the same personnel but is good now for some reason, I guess, I don't know. Incompetent, still trying to figure out how Ideal was alive when his dreams all featured her dying. Workaholic being diabolic in the past and becoming a workaholic to atone for his sins. Renegade being out for everybody's blood for who fucking knows what reasons. Workaholic being out for Renegade's blood for also who fucking knows reasons. The Pinkertons shit, the prison, like, there's just a lot going on here that doesn't need to be happening here, and there's not enough time for any of it to breathe the way it kind of needs to. Towards the end of this act, we do learn some stuff though. For one, what actually happened with Ideal and Watto is that Watto's memories were altered. What actually happened way back when was that the SPX tried to kill Ideal, but Watto jumped in front of it, taking a pretty close to fatal injury. Then Ideal made a deal with the secret police. Take me instead and I'll be your Ideal detective, but you have to let Watto go. And also make sure he doesn't die. So that's settled at least. Like, we have one answer. Perfect. It still leaves a million other questions, but hey, that's what Act 3 is for. Right? Well, we'll see. Section 2, Act 3. The game is over. Hey, so remember how I said there's like a million other questions and that's what Act 3 is for? Well, I hope you don't really care for answers for most of them. The next chapter, The Case of the Paradox Murders, starts with the detectives finding their way into the basement levels of the Snark's research facility. Thankfully, no more of downtown's poison is lingering, but what is lingering are the questions. And also Workaholic and Renegade. They start learning more about everything that's going on, but Workaholic is very adamantly opposed to them reading through the research that's down there. Also, remember how I mentioned Renegade's explosive collar before? Well, that is about to be important in a second here. The way that the collar, again called the decapitation rabbit for some reason, works is that there are several conditions that have to be met for it to go off. It's complicated, but TLDR, there are several different detectives who all have to consent to exploding his head, and one of those is Workaholic, and he himself, like the others, has two options. He can either input his code or whatever it is, and that can contribute, or he can just die. Surely that won't come up later. Anyways, they do more investigating down here until eventually Renegade starts being a menace again, and he cuts the power, takes Posh hostage, and fights with Watto. Watto's been having visions all game of future tragedies, like I said, that's what he got from Ideal. She's explained it as basically, if the end of the road lies in front of you, you'll know about it, but you won't necessarily know how to change it. You'll just know that something has to change. For the most part, this manifests as these long-term visions of everyone dead on the floor, but sometimes it's a bit more immediate. Sometimes, like in the spike trap room, he'll get a premonition about immediate deadly danger and how to avoid it. I'm skipping over a massive amount of dialogue when I'm talking about this between Renegade and Watto because they talk for fucking ever. But the important thing is that Renegade's trying to kill Watto and failing because Watto can predict deadly attacks. Renegade realizes that Watto must have Ideal's power and susses out the parameters of it. Namely that the short-form future sight that lets him dodge attacks only protects Watto from a single deadly attack. It does nothing to protect him from a death by 1,000 cuts, which is where Renegade swaps his strategy from trying to kill Watto to just trying to make him killable. Anyways, this goes on for way too long, somehow Watto wins, Renegade flees, then the power comes back on. Turns out that in the midst of all of this, Renegade had also knocked out Workaholic and left him handcuffed to a bunch of electrical cables or something in a puddle of water, so now he's been fried since the power's back on. And with his death, Renegade's decapitation rabbit is primed to go off. He tries to take an elevator upstairs, but when the doors open up top, his head gets blown off onto the top floor, which is kind of absurd, but whatever. Anyways, the detectives then find his decapitated body when they call it back down, which is interesting. Renegade had left a note implying that he had actually stuck his head in the elevator doors, and that the person who called the elevator was his killer because that had ripped his head off. But I'm like 95% certain his head got exploded long before that, incidentally proving that he seemingly was not the invincible detective. Renegade considers that ideal might have been, but given the whole not alive anymore thing, the evidence isn't super strong for that one either. Anyways, everyone who's still alive returns to the surface at this point. Posh, Gourmet, Incompetent, Bookworm, Doleful, Techie, and also Armor, who's somehow alive again because at the bottom of that bottomless pit there was a hot springs. So he's back in the party now, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, it's decided that it's finally time to solve the stupid case. Gourmet tells them that she is 100% certain that the quartering duke is among the 6 of them, and she knows she's not it, so if they don't solve this case before the rescue ship arrives, she's just going to kill everyone else just to make sure. There is a lot of investigating done, and eventually we learn a few things. First, Watto wasn't supposed to be the one who came through the door of the mansion and had the chandelier fall on him. That was supposed to be downtown, and it was supposed to kill her. See, the big challenge with the quartering duke is that there was never any evidence that pointed to him, only at his victims in a weirdly circular way. And the only consistency between the kills was that it was always a double kill. Turns out, that was because the quartering duke himself never killed anyone. He would find people who wanted to die, or rather they would find him, and he would offer his services to pair them up with another person who also wanted to die. Then he would stage things for the two of them to kill each other. That way there's no killer, and also no shame associated with suicide for the victims' families. Downtown and Senior were both accomplices of the quartering duke who had their own reasons for wanting to die. But at the last minute, Senior decided he wanted to see if it was possible to defeat the Duke by throwing a wrench into the equation, something that could maybe save people who came down the road. And that's why he recruited Incompetent at the last second. This is honestly kind of a compelling approach to the murders, and I think I ultimately do like it. It helps explain the unsolvable crime scenes, which I've never really liked as a trope. Like, it's solvable, we just need to figure out how, you know? And the game highlights that it is a direct result of shame as like a cultural force. Shame in the conditions of one's life, shame that would result from needing to ask for help, and the shame on both themselves and their family if they committed suicide. The quartering duke sets them up, but the actions are all their own. Senior in Downtown didn't even know who the quartering duke actually was because it was all kept anonymous. He basically just does the planning and the logistics, but the actual murders are committed by the victims themselves. I think part of why I like this is that I also find it kind of boring when there is a murderer in a story like this where they stage these elaborate murders and it's like, I did it all to create the most compelling mystery ever known to mankind. Like, that's dumb. The quartering duke feels like he's doing a service to these people and is staging it so elaborately to make sure that nobody can doubt that it's a murder, that these people are victims of a horrific crime, that there is no shame involved in their death for anyone who's still alive as a result of what happened to them, and that they can die peacefully knowing that it'll go unsolved. It's a narrative about mental health in a lot of ways, but we'll get to that in a second because I do think that part of it's a bit more of a mixed bag. Anyways, they've finally figured out who Invincible Detective is, and as a result, who the quartering duke is. Could it be Gourmet? Incompetent? Posh? Techie? Bookworm? Armor? No. It was Doleful all along.
そりゃ愉快に決まってるでしょ。こんな最低な僕のことを心の底から信頼してくれているんだもん。最高に愉快で最強にエンターテインメントに決まっているさ。
This is honestly probably not the biggest plot twist if you've been paying attention and playing this game in one long stretch rather than splitting up into like 3-hour chunks every week for 2 months, but yeah, the guy who can't die is Invincible Detective. Duh. But I mean, I don't hate it. Part of why it works is that Doleful really plays his role well. He really comes across as too weak or frankly pathetic to really have done any of this. He's too beaten down by the world, too traumatized by everything that's happened to him, and too meek to be the quartering duke. So I think out of all the survivors, he was realistically the best choice. It turns out that that was all a front, by the way. He is deeply nihilistic and far, far more confident than he'd ever let on. Even his appearance is an illusion from plastic surgery and hair dye to try and keep himself hidden. Remember, the Invincible Detective was one of 5 kids who escaped the secret police one night. Nobody knew exactly which one it was, though, because Doleful's abilities protected him from that, too. Again, he's not just protected against literal harm the way that Incompetent is with his new abilities, but against the more big picture concept of being harmed. Even the fact that the others were able to identify him here must fundamentally mean that there is no outcome of this where he suffers personal harm in the universe's eye. Or at least, no outcome of this that's worse than what he would have suffered if he'd been able to keep it hidden. Doleful and the universe don't agree on what constitutes harm, to be clear. In terms of freedom from consequences, they're mostly on the same page, but Doleful believes that his existence is harmful to the people around him, which is in turn harmful to himself. The universe disagrees. Doleful wanted to kill himself, but wasn't allowed to, because while Doleful viewed that as harm reduction, the universe apparently didn't. His motivation is also a very interesting one. The very oversimplified version of it, since we'll be diving into it more later, is that Doleful is basically being an advocate for assisted suicide here. The world is torture in his mind, and you shouldn't be forced to live in it the way that he is. If you want an out, you should be given one. Depression, pain, suffering, all of it is inevitable and brutal, and it is cruel, frankly, to force people to keep going, especially under the threat that they'll bring shame to their families if they try and take the, not even the easy way out, just the less long-term painful way out. So instead, he offers people a way to escape all of this. He'll plan out a murder for two people to commit against each other so that they can both be killer and victim, creating an unsolvable murder scene for both of them and allowing them to die while also avoiding inflicting the shame on their families. As the others push back on him, Doleful argues that his numbers prove that his worldview is, if not logical, certainly popular. People were seeking him out in droves to die. Like, he didn't go looking for them. They found him, like I said earlier. The harsh world has beaten all of these people down. There's this big crime wave that's making victims out of everyone, and the system clearly wasn't helping them. Nobody seemed to care about these suffering people, and he offered them a way out. Senior Detective and Downtown Detective were both in that position. Their shame over their personal and professional failures made them want to die, which is why that very first murder happened in this game. It was, in fact, like I said, supposed to be Downtown who walked through the door and died to the chandelier alongside Senior. But Senior's decision to bring Watto along fucked it all up. Senior had given up on his own life, but he wanted to at least give the world a chance to prove that it could fight for a better outcome. So Watto was there to basically see whether hope or despair wins. And this is the ending where hope wins, by the way. Watto and the others are in a bit of a pickle when it comes to Doleful, though. They can't kill him or do anything that would kill him in the end. Similar to how incompetence ability allows him to avoid fatal blows by giving him the knowledge of the fatal outcome of a particular course of action, Doleful's ability protects him from harm on a more meta level. For example, he can be wounded in the most abstract literal sense. He underwent plastic surgery to become unrecognizable after escaping the secret police. So it's not like he's immune to physical damage in the literal sense, even extensive damage. And in game, we have seen him, draw a little bit of blood when he pokes some of those wires in that first wire trap. Rather, it's that the universe will conspire to make the impossible possible to keep him safe. If that means that he endures some superficial damage to hide his identity, then that's allowed. However, if he tried to kill himself by jumping off a cliff, the universe would find a way to protect him. Someone would be able to stop him, or he'd be caught by something in the air, or the ground would miraculously be able to cushion the blow. This is a curse as far as he's concerned, because his immunity to harm doesn't extend to the people around him. In fact, the opposite. If you tried to shoot at him, a random person nearby might feel compelled to jump in front of the bullet. If you try to poison him, someone else will probably accidentally eat the poison instead. Even taking him prisoner is complicated. How do you arrest someone who cannot truly be harmed? It's technically true that he didn't kill anyone. They did all of that themselves. Prosecuting him for it would be incredibly difficult, especially because, again, the universe would conspire to protect him from too severe of a consequence. It's a really interesting way to confront the logical endpoint of the ultimate lucky student being the mastermind of a killing game. How do you out-logic luck? Gourmet is also revealed to have been a member of the FBI who was kind of on loan to the DA, and so this is where she kind of brings in some extra knowledge the others didn't have, as well as some extra authority. And in the end, Doleful's arrested and brought back along with the other survivors. Incompetent, Gourmet, Techie, Armor, Bookworm, and Posh. The last we see the characters is them on the boat away from Morgue, leaving the story fairly open-ended, all things considered. As well, at this point, the game unlocks a new Game Plus mode for you, where you can go back and recover some memories of characters that would have previously been spoilers, so they weren't available to you. However, for all intents and purposes, the narrative is now officially over. It really feels like it was trying to set up a sequel, given how bluntly it ends, but given that this game came out 4 years ago in Japan and 2 years ago everywhere else, and there's not even a whisper of a rumor of a sequel, it feels unlikely. But that means we're done with Section 2. Importantly, while I've covered the narrative of the game, it's important to acknowledge that some aspects of it that make it complicated are things you'd kind of have to experience for yourself to really get it. Things like pacing, tone, and the development of the characters over the course of the narrative. I've given you Cliff's notes on a lot of it, but there's not really a substitute for some of that stuff. Regardless though, by this point, you should ideally be able to see part of why it's so complicated to talk about this game. And we're not done yet. Section 3. What do? What do you do with a game that's complicated? A game that you definitely wouldn't describe as bad, but which you feel like you have to add caveats to before you can say it's good. In particular, what do you do when the caveats are not only complicated, but often spoilers? How do you talk about how the villain's motivations left you feeling a bit mixed on the whole ordeal without giving it all away? How do you explain that it's worth it to play even when you're explaining all the things that you were on the fence about? And how does putting all these feelings down into words actually help to uncomplicate any of it? Well, let's see what we can do. Section 3, Act 1. Was it all worth it? That's a tough question to answer, in part because there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't really get resolved or make sense. Part of the problem of this game is that they needed to edit it down a bit, especially in terms of the backstory, because there's just not really enough time committed to it for it to make enough sense. For example, the Dayless Night organization was formed by the successors of Lucifer, founder and leader of the Morning Star of Dawn Society, who committed the Dayless Night incident. The Morning Star of Dawn was a powerful organization with political and public support prior to the Dayless Night incident, which didn't actually involve a bunch of Lucifer's opponents being kidnapped and brainwashed, along with some human experimentation. That was just kind of a side project, apparently. The Dayless Night incident itself was the event 13 years prior to the events of the game where Lucifer tried to release poison gas into the world under the cover of a massive earthquake. Presumably the one that killed Doleful's parents and buried Gourmet that she ate her way out of. But he was caught by Vidocq before he could release the poison, who went on to found the Detective Alliance eventually. However, before that could happen, some random politician capitalized on the Dayless Night incident to push for the formation of the secret police, whose purpose was not to solve crimes, but to try and create perfect detectives who could then solve them themselves. I think. I don't really know why they needed this, but whatever. In the interim, the Dayless Night organization was apparently formed, but who really knows what's going on with them at this point? The organization, the secret police I mean, were the ones who kidnapped Doleful, Renegade, Incompetent, Ideal, and all of the other kids who were tortured there. Workaholic worked for them back when he was Diabolic Detective, and that's why Renegade hates him. Back during the experiments, Incompetent, who was apparently their Ideal Detective, threw himself in front of an evil Roomba to save Ideal herself, who then volunteered to be the Ideal Detective in his place if they would save him. They did so, and he had his memories of the event altered to think he had failed to save her. A handful of kids escaped, and eventually the organization just collapsed. Maestro Detective, the secret police's leader, exists, but was banished by Ideal Detective, who was the one who basically led the internal uprising against them. Thus, Ideal, along with Vidocq, formed the Detective Alliance out of the bones of the secret police. And now they actually focus on solving cases instead of torturing children. Kind of. They did still keep all the kid torturing facilities and the murder Roombas in Snarks for, I'm sure, innocent reasons, but anyways, while all of this was going on, Doleful, the invincible detective that they couldn't identify because he was always in a group or otherwise made it impossible for him to figure out that he was the invincible one, had been part of the group that escaped. He underwent substantial plastic surgery to become unidentifiable, and then at some point met Diabolic Detective, now Workaholic Detective, who became a workaholic to atone for his sins, on a case and then ended up getting recruited, becoming Doleful Detective in the Detective Alliance. At the same time, he was becoming the Quartering Duke, leader of the Dayless Night. The Dayless Night were part of that massive crime wave I was talking about before that swept Japan, necessitating a huge increase in the number of detectives who were needed, which is how Incompetent ended up becoming a detective in the first place. The Quartering Duke then set off on his unsanctioned medical assistance and dying journey, becoming a prolific serial killer while also working as a detective in the agency that was supposed to be focused on catching him. And that is just the backstory. Confused? You probably should be. Like, that is a needlessly overcomplicated background that's also just never properly explained in a coherent way. It feels like it was supposed to be explained, but then they just didn't. Honestly, Process of Elimination kind of feels like you're playing the second or third game in a series where you haven't played the first ones yet. And while I'm on the record as having said that I'm a fan of being put in a position where we're dropped in mid-narrative, that still kind of requires there to have been a plan in advance. Process of Elimination feels like it needed an editor to come in and say, look, this whole thing with the Dayless Night incident and the Dayless Night as a group and Lucifer and Maestro Detective and Morning Star of Dawn and the Secret Police needs to be cut down substantially. Pick two of these organizations to keep, scrap the other two. Because that's really the whole problem here. Like, they needed to pick a lane. Doleful has two motivations stemming from two entirely separate issues. He is tormented by his danger magnet ability that keeps killing everyone around him but keeps him safe, not allowing him to die even though he wants to, and he thinks that he should have, or no, everyone I guess should have the right to opt out of life if they so choose, just he isn't being afforded that right. And he was kidnapped and tortured by the secret police until he escaped, which is why he wants revenge on him. But like, both of those things don't need to happen. Doleful got his ability before being kidnapped and experimented on. He was already invincible detective, just not a detective. The secret police didn't create Danger Magnet, even though ostensibly they were creating the other abilities. Doleful came by Danger Magnet honestly, which means that the secret police don't need to exist in order to justify his ability. They kind of need to for the others, but not for him, and that's the important one. What's more, Lucifer and the Morningstar of Dawn Society don't need to exist either. Lucifer's whole thing was the Dayless Night incident where he tried to poison everyone, but it failed, so it doesn't really need to be there. You could just say the Detective Alliance or the secret police kind of just was formed eventually. Because that's really the only reason it exists, to create a pretense for the secret police to exist. The earthquake that killed Doleful's parents didn't need Lucifer to be there. It could just be the earthquake that killed them and indicated that he had this power. Give him an Edo in the 100 Lines backstory where he's figured out this thing about himself but has been keeping it a secret all along. In this retelling of things, this reimagining of events, Doleful would just be motivated by his belief that people shouldn't be forced to live. And that is easily his much stronger, or at least much more interesting motivation. It's more compelling in terms of explaining why the murders played out the way they did, and also helps him stand out from among the many other masterminds in similar media. On the flip side, if you're keeping Lucifer and all that stuff, you need to change Doleful so that he's getting his abilities from the secret police, and that his motivation is to take them down. Otherwise, it doesn't really track that he's involved with them at all. They didn't give him this terrible ability. He already had it, so why is he in this? In this rewrite, you need to also make it so that the nobody should be forced to live thing is basically just a pretense for getting volunteers for his unsolvable murders that would create the conditions for him to rise in the DA and then take them all out as revenge for the secret police stuff. And that he's been manipulating people all along just to create the conditions where he could all be brought to morgue, and then he could kill the people who were responsible for what happened to him. Maybe he would also believe that the Detective Alliance were just the secret police in a fresh coat of paint, and so that justifies killing Senior and Ideal for him, even though they took down the secret police. But even with that, this version of him is just way weaker. Doubly so because there's no attention paid to Maestro Detective at any point, who was the actual person running the secret police. And this is all just focused on the Duke himself. What about the others? Remember, we don't learn most of this about Doleful until the very end, so the rest of the story has to also try and get through the narratives of all the other characters too. Incompetent and Ideal both are in this really weird position where there is so much focus put on a couple specific moments in their past, but without ever really contextualizing any of it within the broader timeline of the narrative. This is also why I think the secret police backstory just falls kind of flat. It not only doesn't serve Doleful as much as I think getting rid of it would, but it does a poor job of explaining the other relevant characters and exploring what their whole deal is. Ideal knows more than she lets on, but even when she does reveal what she knows, it's really only that thing about how Incompetent's dreams got it backwards in terms of what happened to her. We learn very little about any of the other people's time in the secret police, and while they benefit more narratively from the existence of the secret police than Doleful does, that's only really with the caveat that they're all functionally wholly divorced from this whole Lucifer side of the plot, which only exists for the purposes of Doleful's backstory, but also doesn't serve him much either because it can't be explored until the end of the narrative, and even then it doesn't do a very good job of it. The characters who are integrated into that plot the most throughout the story, namely Workaholic and Renegade, don't really handle their conflict on the main stage of the narrative either. They're mostly fighting separately and independently while you're trying to find them, both occasionally lore dumping about it, but never enough to make it feel like it's as important as it really is. They spend most of Act 2 playing cat and mouse through the maze under Snarks after Workaholic accidentally kills Rowdy while trying to kill Renegade. And even that feels weirdly contrived. They just, for one, let that happen, but also, they had explained the exploding collar at the very beginning of the game and never thought to mention this incredibly convoluted way for activating it until 2 chapters fully after that murder happened. Which means that the whole time you're just why did he try and do this whole elaborate thing with guiding a spear down a string when we've been told the whole time you could just blow his head off whenever? A big part of the narrative is also that Workaholic believes that Renegade must be Invincible Detective. But that brings with it a whole other can of worms because if that's his theory, then he should know that its efforts to kill him will fail anyways and probably cause collateral damage, right? He's supposed to be aware of that. He was there. What's more, Workaholic directly worked with Doleful. He was the one who got him recruited to the DA in the first place. So he really should have been able to put the pieces together on at least some of that. But again, since we don't really explore Lucifer or the Morningstar of Dawn Society or the Dayless Night Incident or the Dayless Night Group or the Secret Police or the formation of the Detective Alliance or any of how any of these organizations or people really worked, we don't really have the context to understand how any of it could make sense. It's just overcomplicated and underexplained. To answer the question at the top of this section, yes, I do think it was worth it, but that's not the same thing as thinking it necessarily did a good job. This is not an especially long game, all things considered. And that's perfectly fine, to be clear. Not every game needs to be Persona or whatever, but I think that if you're going to try and write a shorter story, you need to make sure your narrative fits into the story you've written. Like, trying to condense all of this into one story was just kind of doing too much, and it left too much unfinished or unsatisfying. Part of why I think my feelings on it are so complicated is that I have a hard time explaining to someone how I think the core story is good, but also that I think so many of the secondary plot threads are falling short, especially since it leaves a lot of other characters really underdeveloped. If we treat Process of Elimination like a bridge, then the main narrative of it, the actual path of the bridge that people can cross, is a pretty solid one. But it often comes dangerously close to not having the necessary support structures in place to actually keep it from collapsing. I think it mostly does still hold it together, but crossing a rickety bridge where it constantly feels like it's going to crumble around you is not exactly the most ideal narrative experience either. In the case of Process of Elimination, it feels like it's frankly just more confident than it should have been that it was going to get a sequel. So many of these threads wouldn't be issues if there was some degree of certainty that another game might explore another aspect of it or something, but given that it's pretty certain at this point that it's a one and done, it really falls short on that front. However, if we're being really honest here, the most complicated part of this game is truly its antagonist. And that's what I want to get into next. Section 3, Act 2, The Quartering Duke Dissected. The Quartering Duke as a villain is complicated. Duh. The basic motivations are compelling, like I said before. Doleful was the victim of his danger magnet ability, who was kidnapped as a child and tortured by the secret police as part of their human experiments to develop agents who were superpowered. He survived everything they threw at him, even experiments that were designed to be guaranteed to be fatal. He escaped along with a handful of others, underwent plastic surgery to hide his identity, and plotted his revenge against the secret police, becoming the Quartering Duke and committing a crime wave across Japan where he'd kill people in pairs where there was never any evidence except a Quartering Duke calling card. It turned out that the reason for that is that he was helping these people who wanted to die but didn't want to burden anyone with the shame or pain of a suicide. So they would seek him out and he'd pair them up with another person in a similar position so they could kill each other and then frame the Quartering Duke for it. There's the obvious narrative complications I talked about before in terms of how I think Doleful has kind of been given two separate backstories that undermine the ability of each other to deliver on their promise, and that's honestly a really hard part to get past with him. One of the challenges of writing a mastermind in something like this is that you have to find a way to present them through the narrative so that once they're revealed as the bad guy, the audience's response is like, oh, of course, now that thing they said or did or whatever makes total sense. And with Doleful, it sorta does, but usually only with one backstory or the other at any given time. Like, why infiltrate the Detective Alliance? Well, because they used to be the secret police. Why does he kill people? Well, because he thinks he's doing assisted suicide, basically, and that's a response to how he wishes he could die because he wishes to stop causing so much harm to the people around him, but his ability won't allow it. However, I don't just want to reiterate what we went over before with this. We've established why I think this doesn't really serve the character or the narrative super well, and frankly, I think that Doleful truly benefits the most if we ignore all the secret police stuff. His strongest aspect, but also the most complicated for me, was how he explained his motivations on the other half of his backstory. When the reveal happens in-game, it's really, really rough. Like, I don't really think I've ever seen an antagonist in a game like this be allowed to be like, I guess, logically correct and rational in the way that Doleful is. He's making an ethical argument about the importance of giving people autonomy and control over their own lives, including whether to end them. He never seeks out victims, they seek him out and execute each other because they want to. He argues that these people want to die for some frequently very valid reasons, including reasons that governments like Canada's literally recognize as valid grounds for medical assistance in dying, and that being unable to do so without the fear that it'll bring shame to their families or whether they'll be able to follow through with it is just unjust. He points to the tragedy of his own life as proof of the cruelty of being forced to live against your own will, how his agency has been taken from him, and not only that, but that the universe's efforts to ensure he stays alive are actively harming the people around him. Again, if someone tried to shoot him during the final confrontation, he wouldn't necessarily be opposed to the idea, but there's a very real chance that something in the universe would have compelled one of the other detectives to jump in front of the bullet, or the gun might have jammed and exploded, killing whoever shot it, or whatever else. It is a morbid moment, to be sure. I remember playing it, and in the moment, feeling like it was almost irresponsible, I guess, to make such a logically and factually sound justification of suicide like this. Like, not to be TMI on main, but I have been there myself. I dealt with a lot of depression and suicidal ideation from around the age of 9 or so, and there was a part of me while I was playing this that just kept thinking, if I'd played this game at the wrong moment in my life, this would have had the wrong impact on me. To be clear, I don't think the process of elimination is going to make people kill themselves, and I'll explain that more in a sec, but There's just something about how Doleful makes his case that makes it so hard to not see him as, I mean, not like a saint or anything, but not necessarily a dyed-in-the-wool villain either. Like, you compare him to the other masterminds of these sorts of killing games, and it's light and darkness, it's night and day. Doleful can't really be compared to a Junko or even like an Izuru. He's kind of doing his own thing there. The debate around the right to die, the right to medical assistance in dying or MAID, and when we should allow people to exercise autonomy around their own life versus when we should intervene to keep them alive, and what obligations we have if we don't let someone take their own life, is a real-world debate, and it is one that is extremely messy in that real world. As a policy position, I do personally fundamentally believe that access to MAID is important on some basic level. Someone who is terminally ill, or someone who is inevitably and unavoidably going to end up experiencing tremendous physical and psychological pain in a way that is incurable and eventually deadly, should be given the dignity of choosing how they die. I have seen family members lose it all to Alzheimer's, and I think it is genuinely cruel to force someone to spiral into the depths of that disease if they would rather simply die on their own terms when they're still able to recognize their family to say goodbye to them. I'm not saying that everyone who has any of these diseases should be forced to go that route, but it should be an option. Forcing people to stay alive, I think, can be argued to be just as cruel in a lot of ways. However, where both Doleful and real-world discussions of MAID run into issues is where you draw the line. Doleful is effectively making the most extreme maximalist MAID argument possible here, that it ultimately shouldn't matter why someone might want to die if that's what they want, even if it's something theoretically or even objectively treatable or fixable about their lives, and that nobody should be forced to get better if they'd rather just die. In the real world, we see both the discussion and implementation of MAID quickly become controversial, to put it very mildly, when it comes to this question, especially because there's a very strong argument to be made that the Canadian government is just using MAID to kill disabled and poor people rather than providing for their basic needs, as it is the responsibility of the state. When I say that that is a strong argument, what I mean is that, in fact, it's not really arguable that they are doing that. The question is about whether or not it should be allowed in the first place. On one hand, you have policymakers effectively deciding to refuse to provide housing, medical care, rehabilitation, and other basic necessities to disabled and marginalized people, and then saying, you can either stay in your current station in life, praying something magically gets better, or we can help you kill yourself. And there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to this worldview. I mean, maybe not about the state refusing to help people, but that people suffering from disabilities ranging from inconvenient to painful but not deadly should be offered MAID. This is a worldview that a lot of disabled people take issue with for a lot of reasons, understandably so. But a big one is that it effectively feels like able-bodied people are saying, if I were in your shoes, I would want to kill myself, like as soon as possible and without any sort of restrictions. I'd want help doing it, in fact. Which is obviously hurtful and cruel in and of itself, especially when the resources do exist to make things far more accessible for them so they can live a better quality of life. Same goes for stuff like depression. If someone wants to die because of a condition like depression or anxiety, or even a more permanent neurodivergence like ADHD or OCD, should they be allowed to? And the most extremist position is to say yes to all of these people. After all, who are you to tell me that I need to keep putting up with this cruel world just because it'll get better? Who are you to tell me that I owe the people around me my continued suffering just so that they don't feel sad about it? We don't have a clear-cut cure for depression, much less a way to permanently fix ADHD or something like that, so why should those be exceptions? If you say someone with terminal cancer should be allowed to kill themselves because they're going to just suffer until they die, then why shouldn't someone with a disability that will forever lower their quality of life in a cruel and ableist society not be allowed to do the same? What about someone with depression so severe that they cannot imagine their life ever being anything but suffering until they die? Is that not a real experience and condition? Should that person not also get to choose? If we consider mental illness to be equivalent, at least in some aspect, to physical illnesses, why are we making that distinction? Should that person not also get to choose? What about anyone else who experiences cruel, brutal marginalization from a harsh society? Is it not cruel to force them to keep existing in a society that will force them into the closet, force them to suffer, force them into a worse quality of life purely because of something like their sexuality, gender, race, or whatever else that they had no control over? What about the victims of generational trauma who feel confident that they cannot break the cycle and are just suffering? Should we force them to keep experiencing that? To be clear, this is, again, the extremist position and not one that I hold. And while I can imagine that just about everyone watching this had a moment in that little paragraph there where they were like, no, I think we're crossing a line here. The thing that makes discussions about MAID so touchy and complicated is that it is implicitly about so much more. It is about how we perceive the experiences of other people, but also about what you might be trying to accomplish with these goals. Policies like MAID in modern day Canada draw uncomfortable parallels to dark parts of not just world history, but very particular parts of Canadian history, specifically like the Alberta Eugenics Board, which ran from the early 1920s until 1972. The only major reform of the Alberta Eugenics Board during that period was just making it so that the people who were being sterilized didn't have to consent. And that was in the 30s, maybe 20s, I can't remember exactly. Survivors of the non-consensual sterilization program my province ran are still alive. I know people who had relatives who were in that program. And if you're saying that minorities should be allowed access to MAID because of a cruel, uncaring society, whether that minority is defined by disability, gender, race, or whatever else, then it kind of feels like you're maybe just motivated by wanting to get rid of those people and masquerading it behind false compassion. Not that everyone is necessarily, but if you're on the receiving end of that, if you're part of that minority group, no one's going to blame you for interpreting it that way. The reason this matters, and the reason I'm bringing it up here, is that Doleful Detective is effectively trying to make that MAID argument. A complicated, touchy subject to begin with, and he's bringing a handful of additional caveats that make it hard to analyze within that current context. For one, Doleful doesn't have the power of the state to make a choice on the course of action the way that a government does. He's not a government choosing not to help these people. He doesn't have those kinds of resources. He just thinks that the system is incapable of helping people, so he's in the right to allow them a way out. For another, Doleful has a perspective that literally cannot exist in the real world. He not only can't be harmed, but he brings tremendous harm onto everyone around him. There's a sentient universe in this universe, I guess, that is actively doing this to him. That changes things. It complicates it a lot, not only because it gives Doleful a unique perspective on what he sees as the cruelty of not being allowed to choose on any level, but because it also implies the more concrete existence of forces that operate beyond what exists in our world. In a world where it is possible for someone to be protected by the universe itself, the debate changes significantly. And more than anything else, I think it's really Doleful's motivation that makes it hard to talk about this game. It is really, 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 really touchy. And while I think it's written very compellingly, because it also does make you feel something when he's explaining himself and making his case, there's a part of it that almost feels irresponsible to recommend it to people. Like, that's what I was saying earlier. What's more, Doleful gets like a good 10-ish, 15-ish minutes. I can't even remember because I was pausing a lot to like argue my way through it in my head and also out loud on stream when I was talking about this. Whatever. He gets like 10, 15 minutes to make his case before the opposing argument even really starts to be made. And while that's pretty common in this genre, you know, the villain gets their whole monologue, they get to break the protagonist, and then they have their moment of, no, it's time for hope. It just, in this context, feels a little different. And I don't know, questionable, I guess, to be in this position where you're just letting someone make the case for why killing yourself is good and fair, actually, and giving them a pretty unique perspective that makes it harder to argue against. I mean, obviously they do push back, and I think they do a good job of making that argument when it comes their turn, but like, those few pivotal moments in the climax are a weird feeling. And in terms of the writing, I'm not saying this is bad, especially considering that it is not a game that was written in English. The translation of it is not always super strong, and I think that they managed to communicate something very raw in this. Like, do not take this as me criticizing the writing, because that's not really the point. It's more just like, it's hard to work your way through those feelings, I think. And I think if this had been a more overarching theme of the game, it would have worked a lot better. Process of Elimination isn't a killing game in the same vein as Danganronpa or even like a death game like Zero Escape, but it still follows a similar structure in a lot of ways. A strong mastermind in those sorts of games is one that plays off the themes of their narrative. In Trigger Happy Havoc and Goodbye Despair, it's based around hope versus despair, which is a recurring theme throughout the story. And in Killing Harmony, it's about truth versus lies, which I think it struggles with a little bit. In Zero Escape, each game incorporates a gimmick based around their mastermind's unique abilities and the theoretical concepts of morphogenetic resonance and what it means to be connected to the world and each other, Schrodinger's cat and the impossibility of getting everything right when you only get one shot at it, and being terrible, respectively. Process of Elimination isn't really about grappling with these bigger themes of autonomy. I mean, like, it certainly comes up a few times, but it isn't really, like, nearly a central enough theme for what they're trying to get you to take away from it. And that's especially important because the elements that are there are very I never asked for this moments regarding how incompetent didn't ask to be brought to morgue or involved in this murder mystery or have Ideal's ghost stuck in his head being a pervert. All of which fly pretty easily under the radar given that kind of all just sounds like protagonist talk. And again, this is really tricky to get right, and I don't want to pretend it's easy or even that they necessarily got it wrong. I think that it's just hard to be like, yeah, this is perfect. No, it's when it's something so obviously contentious and where, yeah, Doleful is the villain. He's the bad guy. Of course, he's making the argument that I don't agree with, but it's not like he's like, yeah, I just love murder. it is more complicated to recommend that to someone. This is also just a really short game in the grand scheme of things, and it's hard to make a theme stick when you're juggling so much like we've talked about before with so little time to explore it all. It's not even like being significantly longer would have necessarily made it easy either. Again, V3 kind of fumbles in its themes in parts because it gets a bit lost in the weeds of itself, particularly in the middle chapters like Process of Elimination did. Except in V3, that's like a full weekend's worth of getting bogged down compared to just an afternoon in Process of Elimination. To me, it feels like this game had a really good brainstorming session at the start, came up with some really interesting, really good ideas, and then was just a little too reluctant to cut some of them when it became clear that they weren't going to play out the way they'd hoped. Either because they'd run into more narrative conflicts than expected, or because it's too hard to communicate through this game's structure, or because the stuff they came up with throughout ended up being better than what they started with. But that's what I want to talk about in the final section of this video. So let's just get into that. Section 3, Act 3. It's still complicated. It probably comes as no surprise that I still feel pretty conflicted about this game. It is a complicated one. One that's clearly at least a little special to me given that I've spent most of this year working on this video as I try to formulate my thoughts about what I feel about Process of Elimination. In part, I think I've come to the conclusion that this is a game that wasn't really meant to be thought of like this. I think it's meant to be a pretty fun, lighthearted, digestible game. It's not trying to be the intro to some saga with deep world building, and it's also not intending to become the next Danganronpa. The easiest stuff to praise about it is the stuff that enhances that simple aspect of the experience. The presentation is amazing in terms of the UI, the music, the character designs, the art in general, like so much more about it. This is a very fun, flashy, pretty game. The gameplay of it is exciting, or maybe not exciting, I guess, but definitely interesting. Like it's a fun game to play. It's not super tense, but there is still some good tension being built throughout it. It has these fun little moments. It has these good little twists. Like it's a good game on that level. But then it also has these glimpses of being a game that's trying to say something more than that. It has this discussion about crime in Japan and the way that politicians capitalize on tragedies to expand on ethical authority of the state, and it's not hard to draw a connecting line between the way that Japanese politicians created the secret police under the pretense of preventing a future Dayless Night incident from ever happening again, and a lot of aspects of real-world politics. You could draw connections to Japanese history, whether on the human experimentation front with Unit 731, or on the authoritarian crackdown side with their heavy-handed approach to solving crime in a frequently unjust judicial system. However, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's also the parallels you could draw between the Morningstar of Dawn Society and Aum Shinriko, as well as the parallels between the Dayless Night and Unification Church, plus a little bit of crossover between them. Very oversimplified history lesson here, but Aum Shinriko was a doomsday cult from the 80s and 90s in Japan that holds a handful of key similarities to the Morningstar of Dawn Society, most notably in terms of their rapid growth as a cult within Japan, as well as their attempted poison gas attacks on Japan. Where the Morningstar failed, Aum Shinriko succeeded twice, killing 8 people in the Matsumoto sarin attack in 1994 and 13 more in the Tokyo subway sarin attack in 1995. The Unification Church, or Moonies, are a Korean cult, and yes, I'm using the word cult deliberately here, with a strong presence in Japan, both in terms of membership revenues and connections to powerful political leaders like the Abe family. They use what are called spiritual sales to raise money, where they basically tell people that if you give them money, then it'll counterbalance some of your negative karma. It's a karma offset instead of a carbon offset, basically. While Aum Shinriko hasn't really been a big name in recent years, relatively speaking, the Unification Church was at the time of the game's 2021 release in Japan. And I think part of why they hedged some bets around Dayless Night is that they didn't want to make the comparison too close to the Moonies because the Moonies were still pretty powerful and relevant at the time. A little over a year after the game's release, that would change dramatically with Tetsuya Yamagami's assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in which he was motivated largely by anger about the Moonies bankrupting his mother and the closeness of Abe and his Liberal Democratic Party to the church. Arguably the most successful political assassination of the 21st century, it has led to a widespread backlash against both the church in general Japanese society as well as in politics. And as of this year, the Moonies are fighting in court against a dissolution order that was issued by the Japanese government. If you interpret Dayless Night as an analogy for the Moonies, and in particular Doleful's role as a leader as an analogy for the leadership of the Unification Church, I think it honestly kind of makes a bit more sense. A major part of the Unification Church's pitch in Japan is basically that the Japanese have a lot of negative karma over their invasion of Korea and what they did there, which, to be fair, Japan as a state kind of does, because there was some fucked up shit going on there. And so they should give money to the church in their minds to pay off that karmic ancestral debt. While they say they don't specify amounts, they do make it clear that the more the better, and it leads a lot of people into a metaphorical financial suicide the way Doleful does with literal suicide. Alternatively, you could argue that someone like Doleful is feeding off the harms of groups like the Unification Church by picking up its victims and encouraging them to kill themselves rather than holding them, or anyone else, frankly, responsible, which ensures that the injustice continues. It's like that meme of the guy who's talking to his neighbor, and his neighbor's like, yeah, every time one of my daughter's cats gets killed by a coyote, I just go get another one from the shelter. And the guy's like, so aren't you just feeding cats to the coyotes? And then his daughter starts crying. Like, that's... Doleful is kind of just the coyotes here. And I don't think you would argue the coyotes in that analogy are the good guys. It's also a game that's making some commentary about America, both on its own and in relation to Japan. The approach to forming the secret police could also be read as an analogy for how the United States created ICE and the Department of Homeland Security in response to the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and how that tragedy in general has been used to justify rolling back American civil rights on privacy, due process, and humane treatment that we've really seen come home to roost decades later. However, it's also not uniformly critical of America. The fact that two of the game's top detectives, Gourmet and Posh, are both Americans is not an accident, nor is the fact that they're from the FBI and the Pinkertons respectively. Those are not uncontroversial or accidental choices for this sort of story, and there is something curious about how it never really seems to want to interrogate what that means for them. I mean, sure, Gourmet's reveal is pretty late in the game, so you could excuse that, but Posh's Pinkerton background is explicitly acknowledged throughout the story right from the jump and uniformly treated as a positive by the other characters, and none more so than Gourmet. The FBI agent coming to the uncritical defense of a Pinkerton and their legacy is not exactly subtle. There's also another non-Japanese character worth discussing in this context. Doleful. Or at least half non-Japanese. He's also half British. Thoughts and prayers. And he's not the only character who draws his connection to the UK. Ideal's real name is Saika Sharonford Holmes, and Incompetent's full name is Wado Hojo. They're Sherlock and Watson. Ideal is even directly compared to Sherlock throughout the game. Multiple times. Like, they are not subtle about this. She is their Sherlock. And Doleful, well, I think he's meant to be Moriarty. It's a more tenuous connection, but the big tell for me is that Moriarty is also almost never actually directly implicated in anything himself. He organizes it and puts all the pieces together, but part of why he was getting away with so much for so long is that he very carefully keeps his hands clean when it comes to the crimes themselves. And to be clear, we're talking about the original stories here. We're not talking about the BBC show or anything like that. But like, that's Doleful's whole deal. They're both tricky villains to take down because they simply organize it but never outright execute it themselves, which makes it hard to get a charge to stick to them. There's also other similarities too that I think help to reinforce it. Doleful also leads a criminal organization, is also being pursued by Holmes, and displays a similar temperament when his plan is finally revealed. Hell, he even seemingly makes a reference to how Moriarty and Holmes seemingly died in the final problem when he mentions that even if he fell off a cliff, he'd somehow be saved. This is, of course, the big difference with Sherlock, Watson, and Moriarty versus Ideal, Incompetent, and Doleful. In this version of the story, it's Moriarty who's unkillable, not Sherlock, and it's Watson who should have been the lead detective all along, but Sherlock offered to stand in his place. Moriarty kills Holmes but cannot be killed himself, and his criminal behavior is built around his danger magnet and unkillability rather than just a more general criminal intent. Watson's guilt over feeling like he failed to save Holmes is also present, but again, in the books, Sherlock got to come back. In this game, Watson is guided by Holmes to finish the job and bring Moriarty to justice. And that's before we even get into Doleful's motivations revolving around this philosophical question about the right to autonomy in dying versus the obligation to try and keep each other alive. The way Doleful explains himself makes it really clear to me that he was written by people who have thought about this stuff before. And the fact that a game like this would even think to incorporate a question about the ethics of assisted suicide, much less make it central to their villain's core motivation, is just a fascinating decision to me. It definitely could have handled it better, again, but I can't think of another game that's made me feel so compelled to argue against it as I'm playing it. Like, to feel the need to articulate why the villain's worldview is so mistaken and flawed. I mean, sure, I obviously disagree with most villains, unless it's one of those games where it's like, you know, Ramatra in Overwatch or Daisy Fitzroy in fucking Bioshock Infinite, where it's like, maybe you have a point. Uh-oh, the story made you go insane, so now you're objectively a bad person, but like, this isn't a situation like that. I lost my train of thought there for a second. The point is, I usually don't think I need to make the case for why something like, I don't know, setting up a killing game with 15 of your classmates just because you love it when bad things happen to people you care about is bad. Like, you can argue against someone like that with their individual points or like why their argument is flawed, but Ideologically, I never felt challenged by Danganronpa, at least the first two. The third one I think has a little bit more going on there, but it's also a lot more contentious, so whatever. There's a whole 6-hour video about why that's contentious. Go watch that if you're concerned. But with Doleful, it feels like you need to push back. You need to put into words why he's so wrong, especially when you're playing it on stream, because it feels irresponsible to let him just say it to your audience. To be able to come to grips with why it feels like a compelling argument at points and still find the counter argument for it. Assisted suicide is such a difficult subject because it requires precision, where any amount of ambiguity has dramatic consequences for the discussion. Like, Doleful isn't wrong in theory when he says it's cruel to force people to keep suffering when they want to end their own lives. But obviously, context matters in terms of who you're talking about. Saying that about someone with terminal brain cancer is very different than saying that about someone who's being crushed by their demanding job or an unsatisfying social life or a lack of success with romance. Doleful relies on that ambiguity to say things that try to lure you in, to make it impossible to just hit him with an outright, no, you're wrong, because he can almost certainly find a scenario in which you would agree with the ambiguous sentiment he's expressing, even if he's using the logic to justify a position that you don't agree with. And that's really interesting to me. It's complicated even more because it's coming from the only person alive who can never be given that option. Someone who literally cannot die and so is forced to keep living and suffering. How would someone in that position feel? We've had plenty of fictional characters throughout literary history who grapple with immortality, but rarely in the way that Doleful does. And I think that it gives him this unique perspective that makes it so hard to just say, no, you're wrong to him. Like, again, he is wrong. I'm not trying to say that he had it right. But he's the rare villain in the sense that he's made me feel like I'm genuinely being put on the back foot by his arguments. Like, I'm not being necessarily convinced by him, but the people around me feel like they are. And that's kind of how it feels in these games when the protagonist feels like they are the sole person standing against it as each person around them falls to despair or falls to this misery. Like, it feels like I need to try and make this rational argument not only to him, but kind of to myself to counteract these points. There were moments during his little monologue there where I was reminded of myself at my darkest points and how crushed I was by all of the things that were bearing down on me. I could see how in Doleful's mind, especially because, again, he is still a child. He's 17. Like, he's been dealing with this since he was very little. That's a lot. In his mind, he thinks he's doing a good thing for people, and I can understand why. And I could see how the people who go to him genuinely feel that they have no other option, like he's doing them a kindness. One of the big points that's made in opposition to him, and it's also a very contentious one, is that by giving his victims an out, he prevents them from being forced to make things better for themselves. Incompetent effectively argues for induced demand, that by offering the service of assisted suicide, Doleful has created demand for it because now it is an option that comes without a lot of the things that typically stop someone from killing themselves, and might eventually force them to make a change in their life or do something about it that could help them. He's removing logistical and social barriers by organizing their deaths for them and staging them to look like murders, which means that the barriers of actually organizing your own suicide or the fear of the shame and pain it might bring to your family are dramatically reduced. What's more, Doleful's weaponizing this against the DA explicitly. If you out him as the killer, if you bring him to justice, he'll expose it all and reveal that all of those victims were really committing suicide. And do you want to do that to their families? Isn't it better to just let them grieve as is rather than being burdened by that shame? They've already gone through this process of grief, and now you're going to bring it back, reopen those wounds, and hurt them all over again. For what? To bring him to justice when he didn't do anything wrong? At least in the eye of the law? And he'll happily concede that, sure, maybe if they weren't given an out via the quartering duke, they would be forced to try and keep fighting and maybe make it out of whatever makes them want to die. He definitely argues that some people are at a point where they're unable to fix their lives, but he also doesn't believe that his services are only for those people. He explicitly argues that forcing those people to keep fighting and fighting and fighting for this is cruel too. That suicide being the easy way out doesn't mean it's a bad thing, even if you do believe that it is an easy way out. He argues that there's no inherent value in being forced to keep suffering. There's no glory in living through it, and there should be no inherent shame in ending that suffering. Are you a coward for taking an ibuprofen to get rid of a headache? Like, that's his logic here. He takes umbrage with the idea that just because some people theoretically can get better, that they should be forced to suffer through that process if they don't want to. He's effectively arguing that the social contract at large isn't a fair deal if you're not allowed to opt out of it. You didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose to be part of a society. So you should get to choose to die if you decide that you don't want to keep playing this game that you didn't sign up for. Why is it on you to tough it out through that grueling job or that loveless marriage or that illness or that marginalization? Why do you owe the world your suffering when it is decided it does not owe you relief from that suffering? To be abundantly clear, again, Doleful is wrong. What makes him compelling as a villain to me is that he's wrong in a way that feels genuinely difficult to grapple with, though. That you can see so clearly how his logic would worm its way into the minds of its victims, how insidiously he could operate to pull the strings, and how he knowingly presents his arguments in the way that makes it the hardest to argue against. Like, he's not arguing in good faith, he's deliberately trying to manipulate this conversation to get out of it. And you can compare that to the villains of other games. You compare that to the spread of despair in Danganronpa, and it's like, sure, within this fictional universe, I guess I can accept that premise, but obviously in the real world, that's not how anything works. This is something different. Despite what he's saying, though, he does entice people into this. He presents it as not just a more attractive option, but as the only option that isn't just full of suffering and hopelessness. He never actually tries to improve people's lives, even though he'd argue that he's unable to because of the danger magnet, but I think you could argue that there's a way to do that at a bit of arm's length. And Incompetent and the others argue that that is the point. It's about being there for each other, for refusing to let them give up, for never letting go of the people around you because you are committed to making sure their future is worth seeing. It's about recognizing that yes, suffering is to some degree an inevitability of life, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still live. And that it's wrong to let someone end it all in a moment of weakness when their suffering can be alleviated, when at some point in the future, they'll be glad that they stuck around. And even in all of that, it does still feel like you need to attach asterisks somewhere. Like, yes, terminally ill cancer patients should be allowed access to MAID if they want it. They should never be forced or coerced into it, but it should be something that they can choose to do if they don't want to suffer. For some people, the option to end their life on their own terms should be on the table. And for a lot of people who have gone through that process, they've described it as one of being allowed to have some dignity, of being allowed to maintain their choice, their power over their life, even to the end, when it felt like they'd lost that. If you've listened to the testimonies of people who've gone through that process, it makes it hard to talk about the nuances of it. And yeah, articulating exactly where the line is drawn is an impossible challenge, but the baseline should be that we should be focused on exhausting every possible opportunity to help people get a better life before that's even considered. We should be housing people, feeding people, protecting and helping and caring for them to the best of our abilities to ensure that when people feel that way, that they are surrounded by both individuals and a society whose priority is making it so they can genuinely get a better life, where ending it all is not perceived as a reasonable, valid option for those people because there's so much more joy to be found in staying alive, even through some suffering, because we are all committed to making sure that it's never going to be a permanent state of suffering. But like, look at all the stuff we've talked about just in this section. It's still complicated. It's so hard to just cut myself off and stop talking about it because everything I like about it is simultaneously interesting and unfinished, but everything I dislike about it is nuanced in a way that makes it difficult to wrap it all up coherently. This is a game that's clearly being written by people who were trying to make a bigger story than they maybe had room for, and who definitely needed an editor who could have forced them to start either making some cuts or expanding the story, but who did write something very compelling. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that you have a character who is disabled. You have Teki, and the argument does affect him in a unique way. He doesn't like the idea of thinking about his own suffering, the disability that's put him in that wheelchair. And Doleful twists that knife fucking hard. That is cruel and hard to get through at points, but it is also compelling. The dignity, I guess, that Teki is given throughout the story, the struggles that he works his way through, the tenacity of his character runs into this wall of a hard argument to beat that is being deliberately tailored to him in some cases. I don't know if I've seen something like that in another story. So much of the problem with it feels like it's represented by how this game's 3 acts break down. A very strong first act, a very compelling final act, but strung together by a middle act that seems like it struggles to get from point A to point B. It spins its tires a lot, particularly in the chapters where you're stuck in that stupid maze, and keeping the timeline of it all straight in the midst of things not being properly explained and so much bizarre behavior happening feels impossible. It has some amazing character moments that I really enjoy, like the reveal of Downtown as Mystic's killer, and especially her voice actress's performance in it, because it's very good, like it sells it. As well as the flashbacks we get to how her and Senior were talking about how they'd be the next to die to the Quartering Duke, but it's coupled with these bizarre moments where characters just kind of act absurd, like when Workaholic decides to kill Renegade but accidentally gets rowdy and then just like kind of moves on. Nobody explains anything to Watto for a lot of reasons, including Ideal believing that once he knows everything, she'll stop existing for him, but also a lot of it is just very contrived. There are moments where a seemingly straightforward concept is taken to a new level in a really compelling way, like how Watto's danger avoidance allows him to only dodge a single fatal blow but can't protect him from death by 1,000 cuts, or how Doleful is basically just trying to answer the question of, what if Nagano Komaeda had the exact same luck abilities but in a universe where that's not a normal thing and the trauma turns him into a serial killer? But then it'll have these weird contrivances like how Renegade's collar was initially just a bomb collar that Workaholic could activate, but which actually has to be triggered by at least 3 different conditions across multiple detectives, including both a verbal command as well as their heartbeat stopping, and it's just like, huh? You get these really good gripping character moments, like Gourmet revealing that she developed her talents after being trapped by the same earthquake that hit Doleful and killed his family, and she survived by eating debris until she could be rescued, or how Rowdy makes every decision using a game of chance that she is rigged against herself to always tell her to do it, because she believes that if she wants to do it enough that she's willing to ask the question, then it means she should do it, and that the cards just give her the confidence to go ahead with it. Or how Bookworm narrates everything in the third person as a trauma response to the deaths of her parents and now Mystic, and that moving forward without them and finding the happiness they all wanted her to have requires her to be able to speak in the first person, to take possession over her own life rather than treating it like it's something she's simply spectating from a distance. But then other characters randomly just get nothing, like Maestro or Lucifer. You have a character like Teki, who, like I was saying, is this really good portrayal of disability in my opinion that never infantilizes him or his disability, but also never makes him the punching bag, allowing him to just be a human being who grapples with his own insecurities and issues in a way that goes beyond just, I'm in a wheelchair and I'm sad about it, and instead makes him a fully fleshed character without erasing his disability in the process. But then he's also alongside characters like Renegade, who's basically just a crazy queer-coded psycho killer playing into a lot of very shallow, lazy, and honestly kind of sometimes harmful tropes. You get a villain who has one of the more unique motivations I've ever seen for a villain in this type of narrative, and who expresses that motivation in a way that is both compelling and personally challenging to fight back against, making it all the more rewarding when you come out on top in the end. But it's built on top of this foundation of sand with half a dozen other aspects of his backstory that make it impossible to really say it was earned when it comes out of left field in the bottom of the 9th, and absolutely obliterates whatever you thought the story was about at that point. Process of Elimination is a complicated game. It is a strange game, it is a flawed game, but after over a year of trying to put my thoughts into writing and 2 hours worth of trying to explain it to you here, I think I can say to you that it's a good game. I have explained my caveats to you, so I can say that I like it. Its gameplay is fun, its narrative is interesting, while there's definitely some stuff it falls short on, it's still a really cool game. It did miss some big opportunities to really hit a home run, and those shortcomings serve to both undermine what it gets right as well as feel like signposts for what it could have done better, but not every game needs to be a home run to be worth playing. It does feel like it would have benefited tremendously from being a franchise of some sorts rather than just a one-off, but I also don't want to hold that against it forever. Its presentation is beautiful, both in terms of audio and video, and it really does serve to carry so much of this game's vibe, even in the areas where the story itself can fall a bit short. They tried to do something a bit new and a bit different, and sure, while not every part of it worked, that's also not inherently a bad thing. We learn by failing as much as by succeeding, and it's the willingness of creatives and companies to take swings on the weird shit that either break new ground or give us the building blocks for future games to grow from. And ultimately, I think it's a good thing that games exist that take swings, even when they do sometimes miss. Part of the exciting thing about gaming as a medium is that it is ultimately still a very young one, and we're still figuring out how it works, even for a relatively straightforward genre like a visual novel. Sometimes someone swings big and makes a very weird game that still resonates with a ton of people like Danganronpa. Sometimes someone swings big and makes a very weird game that is also unfortunately very bad, like Inescapable. And sometimes someone swings big and makes something complicated. Something which we can't easily sum up our feelings on in a few short words, something that, makes us want to see more, something that awakens in us a demand we didn't know existed before. Sometimes we get to see the raw edges of human creativity expressed via the parts of a story that someone loved too much to cut, even if it doesn't really work out the way it needs to, or the events that stuck with someone and shaped their future output, or just see the weird shit that people decided to try and see what happens. Especially as gaming becomes this bigger, more corporate, more AAA space where the rough edges get sanded down in order to fit mass appeal, I think it's really special that that stuff still gets to exist, that we still get to see these games that don't really know exactly what they're doing or don't know exactly how to do it and don't have a million cooks in the kitchen trying to make it exactly perfect for everyone. And yet they still communicate something so special and unique and interesting, and I don't know. Process of Elimination is a complicated game, both as you experience it and as you try and talk about it. And as much as that frustrates me as someone who feels the need to be able to put a neat little bow on everything, I do think that's something very special and very cool for it to be. And that's where I'm going to wrap things up for this one. If you liked the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and if you really liked it, consider becoming a channel member. My channel members get to vote for one video topic per month for me to make, and this is the one they picked way back in April that just took me absolutely forever to make, and I am so sorry for the delay on it. Between this and the V3 video, I have learned my lesson about offering videos in the Members' Choice poll that'll take way too long, and in 2026, I'm hoping to finally be back to putting out Members' Choice videos in the same month that they're voted for, and just generally offering more fitting topics that are a little bit more digestible, I guess, for some of them going forward. All of the 2025 votes have now concluded, but if you'd like to become a channel member for $5 a month on either YouTube or Patreon, you'll be able to vote in the January poll starting on New Year's Day. I'm also still working on how I'll edit videos with the new model and layout going forward, but this is the 9th video with it now, so I hope we're at least getting a bit more used to him. Let me know if you have any feedback on it though. There's not really a blueprint for how to lay things out as a video essayist in general, especially as a VTuber, so I don't know. We're working on it. We'll figure it out. Feedback is greatly appreciated. Anyways, with that, I want to say thank you to my channel members, including everyone from back when this video was selected all the way up to today. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, and Bingo Banga. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, and Jatenar, Ghostbat, Bailey Nichols, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, NJD, and Theo. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Nemo the Survivor, Cadence, Mini Q, Gavost, Yoshi the Wire, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Catlover 192, Corey, Windex the Great, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, DeLeathers, Amon Dodley, Good Guy Luis, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Teo Tamara, Monica Linnell, Please Like Me, Puddinces, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Ismi, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Neelost, Prism, Lily Hero, and Mitsikor. Plus, a special shout out to Curie and Ashton Highlifer for your contributions to the 2.0 debut-a-thon. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.